Even though America was heavily engaged in World War II in the fall of 1942, I felt safe in enrolling in college because the Marines and the Navy had turned me down. I wore glasses. They were still being very selective, and anyone who wore glasses was an automatic reject. However, the Army was not the least bit disturbed by my slight visual impairment, and on September 19, 1942, drafted me as a raw recruit, just a week before classes opened at Michigan State, where I had been awarded a football scholarship. A group of us were inducted at Fort Custer, Michigan, where we were issued uniforms and long-needled shots, sat through films on venereal disease, and took a lengthy IQ test. 2 days later, we boarded a train with blinds drawn and were on our way to parts unknown. Rumors as to our destination quickly began, but no one guessed correctly. After 2 days, the train finally stopped, and some of us sneaked a peek through the blinds to discover we were in Macon, Georgia. Camp Wheeler was to be my home for the next 5 months. The camp was a few miles outside Macon, and, by a long coincidence, happened to be only about 135 miles from my birthplace in the hills of northern Georgia. We were immediately screened for assignment by sergeants who seemed to know all about us. I requested the Army Air Force, but was denied. The sergeant informed me my basic training would be with a special battalion of men who were considered to have officer potential. At this point, the Army really had very little knowledge of our abilities, except for whatever the IQ test was worth. For the next 7 weeks, we struggled through a basic infantry course, with the usual KP and guard duties, with lectures on fundamentals such as military courtesy, some weapons training, and actual firing on the rifle range, bayonet drill, and hand-to-hand combat. Everything was very strange and new to me. I had never been away from home for more than a week, and was totally ignorant of the Army. At first, I didn't know a corporal from a sergeant, and officers seemed like gods to me because everybody, including the sergeants, jumped to rigid attention when they appeared. For reasons quite unknown to me, I was picked immediately as an acting squad leader over 12 men. Possibly this was because of my athletic background, or maybe because, to them, I appeared eager to learn how to be a soldier. The second half of basic was in communications. We were trained in the use of field phones, laying wire, using codes and code devices, and message center operation. The training was interesting, and our lieutenant was an excellent instructor. Near the end of basic, we were told we could apply for Officer Candidate School, OCS, and 78 of the men in my company signed up. Then we found it was not quite as simple to get accepted as it at first appeared. We were required to go before a board of 6 officers chaired by a colonel. They really gave us the 3rd degree. We were asked all sorts of questions, some very personal. Our military bearing and quickness of response seemed as important as the correctness of our answers. It seemed as though they deliberately tried to get us confused, and, apparently, in many cases, they succeeded in doing so, for they eliminated 61 and passed only 17 for admittance to OCS. At the end of basic training, the 17 of us from my company, along with some others from the rest of the battalion, were moved about a mile across camp to non-commissioned officers' school. This was the final step before OCS. It was a very tough, intensive 4-week course, and only 5 of us passed and were promoted to corpora and made eligible for OCS. At last, we were sent across the state to the infantry school at Fort Benning. For the next 3 months, the training was most concentrated and intense. We worked day and night in both classroom and field. It was a damn good, rough, tough cram course on weapons, tactics, map reading, close order drill, field maneuvers, and basic infantry training. Some of the men could not take the rugged physical program or the mental strain of the classes, and so they flunked out and were quietly transferred. Only 2 of my original group survived to get commissions. Somehow I made it, and on May 8, 1943, I was duly commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in the Army of the United States. By act of Congress, we were now officers and gentlemen. Some called us 90-day wonders. My first assignment as an officer was to Camp Croft, South Carolina, as a basic training instructor. Then, only a month later, a group of us were picked out and dispatched to Camp Hood, Texas, to help start up a newly conceived 7-week crash course for the basic infantry training of college students. After this basic, they would be returned to college, and thus, Uncle Sam would not call on the country's future brains as cannon fodder, short of dire emergency. This experimental program never really got off the ground. Only 800 men or so were trained in 6 whole months by enough instructors to cater an entire division of many thousands. Most of the time, we instructors were bored, silly, and exhausted by the effort of trying to find something to occupy our time. Having no students, the instructors practiced instructing each other. After a while, even the brass gave up on the futile effort. So we played horseshoes, volleyball, and found similar pastimes for 6 months. My own training regiment did not receive a single college man to train. Finally, 3 days before Christmas in 1943, 30 of the officers from my regiment were sent to the 86th Division, then on maneuvers in the swamps of Louisiana. We struggled through the mud and rain and ice of the swamps until February 1944 and learned very little, other than how to exist in such terrible conditions. The weather was worse than any I had ever been through in Michigan. Next, we moved into nearby Camp Livingston, Louisiana, and resumed regular garrison training. The Army brass decided, however, that the 86th Division was not fit for combat as a unit and began to break it up. Almost every day we received orders to ship out a few more men and officers as overseas replacements. It became quite a tough job choosing the men for the list, and each unit commander naturally tried to hang on to his best men. Finally, in April 1944, my own turn came, and I was ordered to Camp Shanks, New York, with 7 days leave at home en route. At Camp Shanks, we received all of our overseas shots, and a few days later, we were on our way to England in a huge convoy of about 100 ships, an awesome sight for this young man. After 12 days in the North Atlantic, bucking through a tremendous storm that left most of us seasick, and a little jumpy from 2 submarine alerts during which our destroyer escorts dropped quite a few depth charges, we arrived safely at Liverpool, England, about April 20th, 1944. The first stop was Camp Warminster, a British Army base camp near Bristol. The base was overflowing with American infantry replacements, officers and men bound for combat divisions to replace battle casualties. We at once began some very limited training, mostly to keep us busy. Weapons were carefully cleaned and inspected daily. We also played a lot of ping pong, and I had the fun of pitching a little baseball. When D-Day, June 6, 1944, finally arrived, we watched its progress on a big operations map in the officers' quarters. From this very distant, very safe position, it was hard to imagine the real fighting. Then, late that evening, we began to get a few of the wounded paratroopers and some who had landed in the Channel. They were from the 82nd Airborne, and we crowded around to hear their excited, on-the-scene stories of the fighting. Many of them were on the way back to their units the very next day. Soon replacements were needed, and we were on our way to an assembly area near Plymouth. Security was very tight, and we could only learn that we would be leaving shortly for France. The next day, as I looked into the anxious faces of the officers around me on board the Canadian Landing Craft Infantry, LCI, leaving the crowded harbor at Plymouth, it struck me suddenly, this is it. We were headed directly into the war. Now, near the end of June 1944, our allies had slowly gained a foothold in Normandy, France. Underway, each of the officers aboard seemed to be quietly facing his own personal battle with reality. It still seems a foolish mistake to have had the entire load on our LCI be all officers. The loss of a boatload of junior-grade combat officers would make very big problems for the people tasked with the manning of combat units. Now the words of the port commander leapt back vividly. "You are going to Normandy as replacements." This could only mean that the position each of us was being sent to fill had become vacant because the other officer was killed in action, KIA, wounded in action, WIA, missing in action, MIA, or a non-battle casualty, NBC. All sorts of dismal thoughts chased one another across my mind. I wondered about my fiancée, Florine. How long before she would know I was at the front? Would I ever see her again and hold her in my arms? If I got wounded badly, would she still love me? Would I be able to support her? Somehow, it seemed clear to me that I would make it. I was brought back to the present by the drone of the duty officer calling the roll. As I listened and watched each respond, it was obvious we were a mixed lot. I did not recognize anyone. It probably didn't matter, because we would all be sent to different units once ashore. As hunger began to gnaw at my empty stomach, it occurred to me that none of us had rations. Somehow, we had been sent aboard without chow. Someone took our problem to the Canadian naval captain, who came to our rescue with some cans of split-pea soup from his emergency rations, 1 can each. Each can held about 2 cups and was heated by a cylinder in the center, filled with some chemical that burned. Instructions told us to punch 2 holes in the top of the can before igniting the fuel. Otherwise, the can could explode. The soup was delicious, and I've loved pea soup ever since. Someone was shouting, "Look at all the ships!" and we jumped up to see a glorious sight. Ships by the hundreds were everywhere ahead as we approached Normandy. We strained to see the armada. Huge balloons were straining at cables. They were supposed to keep enemy aircraft from flying too low. The harbor was busy as a beehive. Cargo nets were being loaded in waiting amphibious trucks called ducks. A steady stream came out for a load and then headed back to shore. Vehicles like ants seemed to crawl all over the beaches and inland roads. We lurched forward as our LCI came to a grinding halt on the flat bottom. Gangplanks were lowered on each side of the bow, and we started single file down into the water. Holding our weapons high, we headed for shore. The water was up to my chin, and some of the shorter men had to be helped. The fighting for Utah Beach had been light compared with Omaha Beach. Of course, those who were wounded and died there would never agree that it had been an easy battle. I understand most of the credit for the success goes to General Roosevelt, son of President Teddy Roosevelt. We sure were grateful the beach had been secured. I'm sure much of the horrible results of that battle had been cleared away, and all the dead and wounded were gone. Still, the terrible scars of war seemed to shout at us. Burned-out vehicles, sunken landing craft, ships, tanks, guns, pillboxes lay twisted and still. It hardly seemed possible anyone could have survived. Yet men had waded in and driven the Germans back, now some 7 or 8 miles inland in most places. We marched quickly inland to a replacement center near Sainte-Mère-Église. Our first instructions were to pair off and set up pup tents in an apple orchard nearby. We would stay there until assigned to our units. It was impossible to find out where we would be going or when. Most of us took a good look at the situation map, and it appeared the front was about 3 miles from us. We could clearly hear our artillery all night as a constant shelling seemed to be taking place. The concussion was close enough to shake our tents, and sleep was difficult. Sainte-Mère-Église was the small town made forever famous in the movie of D-Day. There, the 82nd Airborne stubbornly fought its way back toward the coast to link up with the 4th Infantry Division. Had I known the 4th was to be my unit, perhaps I would have asked more about the battle there. Since we were not confined to camp, several of us took the opportunity to see some of the battle area nearby. Our noses and grapevine information led us to a burial site about a quarter of a mile away. The ghastly stories we had heard about the fierceness of the fighting were true. German war prisoners were digging up the partially decomposed bodies of their own, dead, buried in neat rows in mass graves about 3 feet deep, for movement to a new location. Working with shovels and bare hands, the prisoners stuffed the corpses into mattress covers and piled them on trucks in rows, like cordwood. Some of the bodies were badly mangled and very difficult to pick up. Stern-faced men turned white, and many had to turn away to vomit at the sight and smell. The guards stated that several hundred American bodies had already been moved a few days before. Over 300 Germans had been buried in the mass grave, but the 2 fields were being cleared to make way for a fighter plane airstrip. Near the graves were the wrecks of many gliders, some still hung up in trees, others smashed into hedgerows, all riddled with bullet holes. It's a wonder to me that any of the glider troops survived or were able to fight once on the ground. I had tried to join the paratroops shortly after OCS. I was rejected because I wore glasses. We walked through a field that had been shelled by the Navy, probably with rockets. The holes were about 4 feet deep and 6 feet across. They covered a pattern about 20 feet apart over a couple of acres. It seemed impossible that anyone could have survived such a bombardment. We were pretty quiet as we made our way back to the tents. For me, the cruel realities of war came into vivid focus, and for the first of many times, I felt the intestinal stirrings of fear. Finally, on July 12th, orders came through. I was assigned to the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division. About a dozen of us climbed onto a 2.5-ton truck and were driven through Quarantaine on our way to service company of the 22nd Infantry. Our first taste of shelling occurred as we crossed a small bridge near Quarantaine, but it screamed overhead and exploded about 100 yards beyond us. Captain Hawkins, the commanding officer, CO of service company, met us warmly. He took us directly to headquarters of the 22nd Infantry nearby, somewhere in the swamps near Quarantaine. Colonel Buck Lanham was there to greet us. He was a small, wiry man who looked as tough as he was gruff. He wasted no time in scaring the hell out of us. He stated flatly that the German resistance was very stubborn, and our losses were extremely high. He explained how tough it was to cross a field with the Germans dug in behind every hedgerow. Machine gun crossfire made advance very difficult. We are only able to gain a few hundred yards each day. As officers, I expect you to lead your men. Men will follow a leader, and I expect my platoon leaders to be right up front. Losses could be very high. Use every skill you possess. If you survive your first battle, I'll promote you. Good luck. After our brief indoctrination by Colonel Lanham, we were assigned at random to various battalions within the regiment. 5 of us were ordered to follow our guide to 2nd Battalion headquarters, then in regimental reserve, roughly a quarter mile behind the front lines. Our guide was a corporal who was tired, hollow-eyed, and jittery. He acted like a cornered animal. Just watching his actions gave one the creeps as, bent low, he ducked and ran from one piece of cover to the next. We ran with him down farm lanes, between hedgerows. Some were sunken below ground level. We passed many empty foxholes dug along the banks. Some were partially covered with wood or metal torn from some farm building. Bodies of dead Germans were strewn along the way. They lay as they had fallen, in grotesque positions, glossy-eyed, cheeks sunken, mouths open. The awful odor of death was increased by the hot July sun. The guide said our dead had already been moved, and we were grateful. 2nd Battalion headquarters was in a rather large field with most of the battalion dug in nearby. Headquarters was just a small 10 by 12 tent set up under a tree near a hedgerow. Lieutenant Colonel Lum Edwards was in command. He greeted us briefly but made no speech. Captain Tom Harrison, the S-3, assigned us to companies. Lieutenant Pizarac and I were assigned to E Company. We became very good friends and served together from July until November, when he was killed in action. We had to go across the field to report to Captain Holcomb, commander of E Company. Lieutenant Pizarac was assigned to the 1st Platoon, and I was sent to the 2nd Platoon. Lieutenant Plume and Lieutenant Towis had the 3rd and 4th Platoons. One thing I felt important was learning the names of my men, so I made a real effort, and the men were pretty surprised to have me call all 40 of them by name the very first day. My first concern was my non-coms. Sergeant Chick Reed was the platoon sergeant. The assistant platoon sergeant was Otha Anders. These men had landed on D-Day and had about 1 month's combat experience. I was grateful they were both willing and able to give me a lot of useful pointers on what it was like at the front. At least 4 other officers had already been casualties in my platoon, and only 5 men of the original 40 who landed on D-Day were still assigned. I was lucky to have a few days with my new platoon before going into battle. Later, I saw many green lieutenants sent up to take over platoons in the thick of battle. They had no chance to meet any of their men or to find out who the non-coms were. I can't imagine a tougher, more demanding job being thrust upon any young man than that of a frontline infantry platoon leader. My platoon was dug in behind a hedgerow directly across the field, about 200 yards in front, of our battery of 105 millimeters self-propelled artillery. At first, this didn't concern me, but it proved to be quite disturbing as they began firing during the night. Not only was it very noisy, but the concussion caused the sides of my foxhole to cave in several times. Of course, sleep was almost impossible, even without the artillery, for my mind was filled with fears and questions about what it would be like to lead men in combat. How would I face my responsibilities? Perhaps tomorrow would tell. One evening, just before dark, while standing in line for hot chow, we got a real thrill. 4 German fighter bombers zoomed right over us at treetop level. We scattered instantly and dove for the nearest cover. But their targets seemed to be somewhere near the coast. In seconds, just about every anti-aircraft gun and machine gun within range opened fire, and we could easily follow the path of the planes by the red glow of the tracers. Every 5th machine gun bullet was glowing white phosphorus to help the gunners see where they were shooting. The display looked just like the fireworks back home on the 4th of July, but the planes were so fast and so low that they were gone before anyone could take good aim, and none of them appeared to be hit. About July 16th, our regiment moved northeast, close to St. Lo. Here, we got the news that we were to become part of a special task force of tanks and infantry, with no other purpose than making a major breakthrough of the German lines. This was the first large-scale tank infantry team action ever undertaken by the Allies. The enemy in our immediate front was to be carpet-bombed before our jump-off, and then a large army of tanks and infantry would drive through any hole created. The crucial problem was the hedgerows. In Normandy, for generations, the farmers had grown hedges to separate their fields, however small. They had started by digging small ditches around the edges of the fields. The earth was piled in rows between 2 fields, and over the years, many of these dirt piles grew to become over 2 feet thick and 3 feet high. Hedges were planted on top, and their roots prevented erosion. Various bushes and trees also took root to form a barrier strong enough to fence in livestock. The Germans, of course, seized upon hedgerows as the natural earthworks they were. They were excellent for the defense. Easy to hide behind, the thick dirt embankment served as a very good shield against our small arms. Usually the Germans put machine guns near the corners of each field, giving them a crossfire that made a frontal attack by infantry nearly suicidal. Sometimes the poor infantry would fight a whole day to gain a few hundred yards, and that only if they were lucky. The special tactics that were developed called for the tanks to break out into a field and spray the next hedgerow with their machine guns while the infantry walked or ran behind the tanks, using them as shields. But when the tanks got close enough to the hedgerow, they'd raise their fire a little, and the infantry would run ahead, keeping as low as possible, throwing grenades over the hedge. The tanks would plow through the hedges, and the infantry would follow closely, then fan out to either side to capture any remaining enemy. Originally, a tank could not handle a hedgerow very well, because the dirt mounds would tilt them up and expose their relatively vulnerable underbellies to the German Panzerfaust, a lethal, armor-piercing rocket grenade similar to our bazooka, capable of knocking out a tank. After a while, a sharp steel scythe-like bumper, fashioned from old train rails and the scrap iron from German beach obstacles, was welded to the front of tanks about a foot above the ground. It sliced a chunk out of the hedge, which allowed the tank to keep low as it burst through and took the Germans by surprise. If all went as planned, we would mop up the enemy and continue the attack across to the next hedgerow and the one after. The tactic seemed practical enough, but even in dry runs it was utterly exhausting to carry all our gear while running behind tanks, bathed in their hot fumes and the churned-up dust. After several days of grueling drill in the new tactics, we were ready to go. Every day we got our gear together and waited for orders to jump off. That went on for about a week, because the bombers that were to do the carpet bombing were grounded by the rotten weather. All the waiting didn't do our nerves any good. Meanwhile, there were a few sidelights. One day I came upon one of my young soldiers who had his pistol in hand, apparently getting up the nerve to use it on himself. He was terribly depressed because he hadn't received any mail from home since his landing in France. I sat down and quietly talked with him alone for quite a spell, until he was assured his family really did care, but that our mail was all messed up because of the fighting. The very next day he received a couple of letters, and that snapped him out of his depression. One day our ever-resourceful cooks decided to treat us. They said that a nice young cow had wandered into enemy mortar fire, and that fortunately they had been nearby and so knew it was fresh meat. The steaks were a marvelous change from regular army rations. A little later, however, Captain Holcomb was somewhat embarrassed when a French farmer came calling and excitedly demanded payment for his slaughtered cow. He was turned over to a major from military government, and I suppose something was worked out. Another day, Major General Barton, our division commander, held a regimental review to award medals for heroic actions since the invasion. As we marched by companies to the parade field, some German fighter planes roared over at treetop level, and men and heroes scattered in every direction, with some diving right through dense hedgerows. The planes never fired on us, and may never have seen us, so we resumed our march to the review. We kept looking over our shoulders, but the planes never circled back. One of the men had some barber tools, so we took turns sitting on a stump for a quick haircut. I don't remember getting my hair cut again during the next 8 months. It was probably very boring for most of the men to sit quietly and wait for the attack to begin, especially since the jump-off dates were changed several times. All of the officers were very busy. We spent hours studying maps of our objectives. Aerial photos were very accurate. With the use of special angles in glass, the photos showed orchards so close we actually could count the trees. Some of the photos were only a few days old. I was impressed with all the information at our disposal. I hoped the Germans didn't know as much about us, but felt they could not because of our air superiority. On July 25, 1944, the big attack finally got underway. The faraway drone of planes grew to a deep rumble as hundreds of huge bombers passed directly overhead, filling the sky. We were told there would be 3,000 bombers and 500 fighter bombers in the raid. Ours was a grandstand view, just behind the front lines, and we watched in complete awe as wave after wave paraded over us. There seemed to be about 200 planes in each formation. What was splendidly inspiring for us must have been terrifying to the Germans. The earth beneath us shook as strings of bombs began to explode just to the front of our infantry lines. The rush of air from the blasts gave us a good push, even though we were a half-mile away. Our orders were to jump off and attack immediately after the bombing to take advantage of a stunned, confused enemy. Staggering misfortune stepped in, however, with a cruel blow. One whole wing of bombers miscalculated and dropped its entire load on the front lines of one of our divisions. The losses in dead and wounded were over 800, including the killing of Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, Army Ground Forces commander. This tragedy and its confusion caused the postponement of the attack one more day. The Germans, meanwhile, used the respite to bring up reserves to fill in much of the area the bombs had knocked out. The enemy we faced thus were a mixed lot of survivors of the bombing, plus newly arrived paratroopers. My personal longest day began as we jumped off my first attack the next morning, July 26, 1944. As soon as we crossed the Saint-Lô-Perrier road, just west of Saint-Lô, we came upon a dreadful sight. The destructive power of those thousands of 500-pound bombs overwhelmed the senses. The dead from both sides lay twisted and torn, some half buried by overturned earth. Bloated cows with stiff legs thrust skyward in death lay everywhere, as did burned-out vehicles and blasted equipment. I've never been able to erase it from my mind. When the order to move out had first come, my muscles had been taut with fear. After a while, I realized that somehow my body was moving forward behind the tanks as my platoon took the lead. It seemed to me like the first few moments of a football game. As we advanced, I began to feel my mind and body working together again. Still very scared, but functioning. Our tank company was wonderfully aggressive, shooting up everything in sight. The tank commander's tactics were very sensible, it seemed to me. Since no Americans were ahead of him, his orders were to shoot and shoot. All that tank firepower blasting away kept the enemy pinned with his head down, unable to return fire, and allowed us to advance rapidly and capture many prisoners with very few losses. Many of the Germans were still in shock from the bombing, and many had no desire at all to fight. Actually, I don't understand how any of them even survived. Bomb craters, big enough to swallow a jeep, were so close together in some areas, it was difficult for our tank drivers to zigzag through. Once, as we rounded the hedgerow at the corner of a big meadow, one of our tanks accidentally ran over a dead cow. It was bloated, and when it burst, its entrails wound around the tank treads, and there was the terrible mouth-filling stench to add to the gore. It was too much for me. I fell down on my hands and knees and was retching miserably when the sudden roar of a diving plane made me look up, just as one of our P-47s let go 2 bombs directly above me. I dove down flat in my own vomit, needlessly, for the bombs sailed on another 200 yards ahead, and knocked out a jerry-armored half-track I had not even known was there. A few minutes later, I lost my first man. He stood right up in an open spot and tried to match his rifle against an enemy half-track. They machine gunned him down and fled. I shuddered at his futile death, for a rifle was not much use against steel plate, and letting yourself get caught in the open by a machine gun is fatal. Better to take cover and fight again than to take foolhardy risks. If he'd armed himself with a rifle, grenade, or bazooka, it might have been a different story. I felt sick. Our first village, Saint-Gilles, now was close in front, and we approached with caution. It was just a small crossroads hamlet with about 30 buildings that seemed to go about a block in each direction from the one intersection. The buildings were close together, like stores, and built right up to the narrow street, with no sidewalk. The backyards were open country. My platoon swung to the right across the fields and came into the village from the right, or west end, and headed toward the central crossroads. My men and I were walking on either side of the road, following our lead tank into the little burg. As we approached, I was on the left beside a high stone wall, and the first buildings were just ahead, not over 10 yards beyond the end of the wall. Suddenly, a shell exploded inside the first building beyond the wall, and instantly I hit the dirt. When I looked up a few seconds later from my prone position in the brick gutter, a Jerry Mark IV medium tank was cutting around the corner only a short block away and heading directly toward me. Our Sherman tank and the Mark IV began to fire at each other at once from point-blank range. Our tank began to back up as it was firing, apparently looking for some kind of cover. And this left me in front, actually between the two tanks. I looked around frantically, but the stone wall appeared impossible to climb, and the buildings ahead were too close to the oncoming Mark IV. So I stayed flat in the gutter and watched the tank battle. Each tank fired as rapidly as possible as the distance closed to less than 100 yards. The muzzle blasts shattered windows in the houses and storefronts, and each explosion knocked my helmet halfway off my head. The narrow, walled-in street seemed to act like a sound tunnel, and the concussion smashed at my ears. My wife tells me today I'm somewhat hard of hearing, and I'm not very surprised. The Mark IV kept firing as it came toward us. Both tanks somehow kept missing at this close range, or their armor-piercing shells were bouncing off. Finally, after an exchange of about a half-dozen rounds each, the Jerry suddenly went up in flames. 2 Krauts crawled out of the tank's belly escape hatch and ran back for the corner. Both were knocked down by machine gun fire from our tank. The German tank commander, a sergeant, then jumped down from the turret and charged right at me. I struggled to my feet but could not raise my ML rifle to my shoulder. As I shook with excitement and fright, my rifle came up to my waist and fired 3 times, and was empty. Had I been more experienced, I would have reloaded my rifle before walking into the burg with a clip of 8 bullets. On the other hand, it was probably better for my peace of mind that I didn't have a full clip, for I probably would have killed him. After he had fallen, I did my best to reload but was all thumbs. I just couldn't get that damned clip to fit into the breech. The Kraut sergeant had blood seeping from his ears and mouth due to the concussion of his tank being hit, and, with his eyes staring directly into mine, he grabbed his thigh where my bullet had struck, and then hobbled across the street into a doorway, all before I managed to get my rifle reloaded. Luckily, he never attempted to shoot me with the pistol he wore as a sidearm. He must have been in much greater shock than I, and had every right to be unable to function. We didn't pause to search the buildings, so I don't know how badly he was hurt. The shooting of my first man, face to face, was not covered by the infantry school back at Fort Benning, and I was deeply shaken. I'm glad I didn't kill him. The shock was bad enough. Going through the slam-bang tank duel beforehand hadn't helped. I was still trembling a few seconds later and would have been unable even to defend myself. My first hour in combat had been enough for my lifetime, and I was wondering if I'd last the day. Because of the burning Mark IV in the middle of the street, another rifle company from our 2nd Battalion detoured around the buildings on our right. When this company came to the crossing road, they turned to their right and continued the attack toward Kinesi. The artillery forward observer, flying in a Piper Cub overhead, mistook this company for Jerry's retreating out of town, and called down a very heavy barrage of 105 millimeters artillery on them. This blasting of our own men was stopped as soon as possible, but not in time to prevent many casualties. I'll never forget one GI lying in the road with a huge gash all the way through his shoulder, one leg badly mutilated near the ankle. A medic gave him a shot of morphine and slipped a cigarette into his mouth. The wounded man raised his good arm to us as we passed and yelled at us to go get the SOBs. Of course, he didn't know he was talking about our own artillery. Most of the time, our flying forward observers were great, but identification from a maneuvering plane can be tricky, and mistakes resulted in a few tragedies. Our progress was good, and we had taken quite a few prisoners as we approached the next town, Kanisi. It was getting along into the late afternoon of a long, long day, and we were near exhaustion when one of the commanding officers gave us a chance to rest. He called for fighter bombers to hit the town before we went in. We flopped down where we were in an apple orchard and sprawled out with our backs against a hedgerow, hoping we'd never again have to move. During this delicious respite, one of my sergeants had a premonition. He came to me and asked if I'd make sure his personal effects were sent home if he didn't make it. I tried to talk him out of his obvious depression, but got nowhere. A little while later, as we rested against the hedgerow facing the front, we heard one of our tanks making a big racket coming up to the hedgerow behind us. We got out of there fast, except for the sergeant. We yelled at him to get moving, but he just sat in a daze as the tank plowed through and buried him alive. A bunch of us dug him out at once, but it was too late. Thus, my second man was gone, and he as needlessly as the first. I knew then I'd never survive if I let myself get tied in with every case. It was vital for me to build some sort of protective shield within myself and concentrate only on what had to be done in the present and how to do it. I forced myself to suppress all thoughts of prior losses and gruesome mental pictures of the tragedy of war. A little later, the fighter bombers hit Kanisi, setting many fires and creating more rubble. We mounted our tanks and went on in. It was a bit larger than Saint-Gilles, up to maybe 700 or 800 people. The drifting smoke screened the fires a little and made an eerie glow in the oncoming darkness. It was all very spooky, and it seemed my eyes couldn't travel fast enough to find signs of a hidden enemy who might be watching us as we rode through town on the backs of tanks. Fortunately, the Jerrys had pulled out, and so we pushed right on through Kanisi and into the night. Now we were in even more of a no-man's land. The Germans were so unaware of our penetrations that in the darkness a German tank came up from the side and was moved right into our column by a smart MP, and then one of our tanks knocked him out from the rear. As the Nazi tank burned and its shells began to explode, we were forced to detour in the field around it. When we returned to the road, a German colonel drove up with a staff car and was immediately captured. At 2:00 a.m., we were still going strong and getting near our first day's objective, Le Mesnil-Herman. My platoon was in the lead again as we approached town, and I was on the armored platoon leader's tank, which was third in line. The point tank stopped about 100 yards ahead, halting the whole column. And in the lull, we immediately heard German voices jabbering away, apparently excited at seeing American tanks 6 miles behind what they thought were their front lines. Their chatter came in clearly, even above the noise of our idling tank motors. I was now able to spot their voices at no more than 10 feet from the right side of our tank, and I knew we had only a moment. I threw a hand grenade and at the same time yelled at Sergeant Williams, just behind me on the tank, to shoot his rifle grenade. Just a second later, the Germans let go with a Panzerfaust, and I think our firing first may have upset their aim, for they missed the broad side of the tank, where we were sitting, and instead hit solid front armor about 3 feet to my left. The armor-piercing shell of the Panzerfaust exploded, but the angle was wrong for penetrating the armor. Nevertheless, it left huge cat-like claw marks across the front of the tank, some almost 2 inches deep and very jagged. My hand nearest the blast stung sharply and turned out to be burned. I can't help believing that if we hadn't gotten off our grenades so quickly, the German aim might have been truer, and our tank would have blown up and taken the rest of us with it. But the tank commander inside our buttoned-up tank evidently wanted no more of that spot, for suddenly we took off at full speed, jerking ahead so fast that some of us nearly lost what were at best very precarious seats. At that moment, our fourth tank, just behind us, was hit by a Panzerfaust and burst into flames. I had no hope at all for any of the men, the 5 crew members inside, and all of my 8 men riding the back. I really don't know their fate. I never saw any of them again. Now, we had a new problem. Previously, the darkness had been some protection, but the flames of the burning tank lit up our road as brilliantly as a high school football field on a Friday night. We felt as though we were suddenly naked on Main Street. Our 3 lead tanks now were bunched up about 200 yards past the burning tank and some 300 yards short of Le Mesnil-Herman. My men and I piled off and took cover in the small ditches by the road. The hedges were not very close to the road there, and that was something of a good break, because Panzerfaust teams couldn't get quite so close. The only way I could communicate with the tank platoon leader was through a field phone we'd rigged up on the back of his tank, and I used it now to talk over our awkward situation. We decided to radio the CO for instructions, since it didn't seem sensible to try to go on into Le Mesnil-Herman, with only 3 tanks and 24 riflemen. The tank lieutenant had been in the fighting in North Africa and Sicily, and, since it was my first day in combat, I asked his opinion on what to do with my men. He suggested I spread them out a little more to make sure the Germans didn't get too close with a Panzerfaust. Our radio instructions seemed slow coming in, and we waited nervously in the bright light for minutes that seemed to drag into hours. At last we got word simply to turn around and rejoin the main body of the task force, now in a field about a quarter-mile back. Great. But how? The tanks had to stick to the road, brightly lighted though it was, and that sure didn't look very attractive to me, but I couldn't see any other way out. The tank lieutenant suggested I keep my men spread out while they turned the tanks around in the road. This done, I asked what next. Well, he said, it looks like the only way out is to make a fast break for it. Then should I get my men mounted back on the tanks as fast as I can? I asked. Hell, no, he snapped. They'll shoot your men off like flies. Without another word, all 3 tanks took off so fast the phone on the command tank was jerked from my hand, and we were left standing in the road with our mouths open. I was furious, but I knew I couldn't waste time on anger. Something had to be done, and fast. Some of my men were on the edge of panic. One was crying, and I noticed a few others were trembling. I didn't particularly blame them. We were surrounded by Germans who could see us plainly and soon should move in on us. We couldn't even call for help because our radio man had left his radio on one of the tanks. We were completely on our own. As the tanks had charged away, one of my men had run after it, trying to grab on from the rear. His feet bounced a couple of times in the road, and then he had to let go because of the extremely hot exhaust. So, he was stuck with the rest of us. The Germans shot Panzerfausts at each tank as it passed the one still on fire, but they missed every time. The tanks thus had been lucky enough to get through. Now it was our turn to run the gauntlet. The instructors back at Fort Benning had never told me what to do in a situation like this, so I probably did everything wrong. I did remember one of their morsels of general advice, however. When in doubt, get off your butt and do something. It might take the enemy by surprise. I quickly got the sergeants together and told them that my simple plan was to make a break right down the road past the burning tank, fighting all the way. One thing in our favor was that I'd made each man carry 4 hand grenades instead of the usual 2, my first hunch. My orders were to move out in single files on either side of the road, with the men 10 yards apart, and no 2 abreast to avoid bunching. Each man was to have a grenade in hand to be thrown over the hedgerow on my command. After getting rid of the first grenade, they were to run like hell. While they ran, they were to keep throwing grenades as often as possible, but to be sure to keep on running. When they were out of grenades, they were to fire their rifles at the top of the hedges while they ran. When rifles were empty, the orders were to keep on running without stopping to reload. Grimly, and without a word, the sergeants moved off and quietly lined up the men. In a few moments, we headed for the burning tank. Platoon Sergeant Reed took the lead on the right, and I took it on the left, since I already knew where the German Panzerfaust team was on that side. The other sergeants brought up the rear. On my side of the road, there was no hedgerow for some 75 yards until we came to the corner of a field. As we walked toward this hedge, I carefully pulled the pin from my grenade, just in case it was needed, quickly. When I had walked only a few yards, which seemed miles, beyond the hedgerow corner in the glaring light, I heard German voices just over the hedge. Evidently, they were excited about seeing American infantry walking openly down their road. I instantly threw my grenade. The Germans yelled, "Grenade! Grenade!" and I could hear them scrambling for cover. I then yelled, "Let's go!" at my men, and we broke the world's record for the 440. Somehow, I threw my other grenades and emptied my rifle as we tore along the road. The Jerrys fired machine guns and tossed grenades into the road. One grenade landed about 3 feet from me, but I was long gone when it went off. When we passed our burning tank, we were too scared of enemy action to worry about any of its shells going off. It was very hot and bright, almost incandescent, and smelled of burned flesh. A couple of dead GIs lay by the road, but we couldn't help them, so we kept on, pounding down the road, like a bunch of berserk Indians, firing all the while. Suddenly we came upon the poor GI on guard in the road for our main body, and he just stood there transfixed, as though he'd seen a ghost. He couldn't even open his mouth to challenge us. I checked my 24 men, and all had made it, though 2 were slightly wounded. We had been miraculously lucky. It was now about 3 a.m., and my longest day finally was over. We dug slit trenches just deep enough to get our bodies below the surface of the ground, then tried to get some sleep. Though I was totally exhausted, my mind was much too wound up to relax in sleep. The tragedies and excitement of the day kept racing through my mind, over and over. Also, the Germans were famous for counterattacks, and I didn't know at what moment they might come. I knew 2 of my men had been killed and 2 others wounded, and I could only assume the 8 riding the blazing tank had been killed. I hoped some of them might have escaped, but I didn't see how. I certainly did not consider myself any sort of hero in any of this action, but my men thought otherwise. They wrote me up for a Silver Star for gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty. It was duly approved and later presented to me in person by our division commander, Major General Barton. Thoughts of a medal had never occurred to me, though I did appreciate it once it was awarded. My thoughts during the action were very rudimentary. How in hell do we get out of this mess? As it turned out, all we needed was speedy action, and a tremendous amount of good luck. Speaking of luck, I had indeed been very lucky to survive my first day of combat. In the tank shootout at St. Gillis, if the Germans had knocked out our tank, I'm sure they would have turned machine guns on me, and at 30 to 40 yards, would have mowed me down. Again, when the Germans hit our tank with the Panzerfaust, just a foot to the left would have knocked out the tank and me with it. My rabbit's foot worked great that day. The few remaining hours of darkness passed uneventfully in the task force bivouac, a large field a half-mile north of Le Mesnil-Herman. Few of us settled our nerves enough to sleep, and the cold, damp earth of our slit trenches had not eased our muscles. At first light, we were told to get ready to move out again. The orders were inevitable, but the part that galled me was that my platoon was to lead the attack again. Customarily, each of the 3 rifle platoons in the company took turns up front, which was only fair. Captain Holcomb explained it was the battalion commander himself who insisted my platoon lead again, since we had been the last ones in contact with the enemy and therefore knew his location better than anyone else. I still felt misused, but didn't trust myself to say anything. We struggled off in the attack after hastily jamming down a cold K-ration breakfast. This time, as we headed for Le Mesnil-Herman, we at least could see where we were going and didn't have to stick to the road. The tanks cut straight across the hedgerows, behind which the Germans had been the night before. Rifles and machine guns opened up on us at once with an angry clatter. My men ran over the rough field as fast as they could to get behind the tanks, and they fired their rifles back at the hedgerows whenever possible. They panted for breath, and their faces were flushed. Each tank had 2 machine guns and 1 75mm cannon, and they let go, with all weapons blasting away as they drove ahead. The enemy were so well pinned down, they didn't even lift up enough to fire their Panzerfausts at our tanks. Soon, our combined firepower was too much for them, and they began to wave white handkerchiefs. I learned later that over 200 prisoners had been taken in this attack, and I'm sure, glad I hadn't known, there were that many of them around. Some of them, I think, must have come from beyond the small fields we fought in. The Germans usually were very good at taking care of their dead and wounded. After burials, they stuck a bayonet on the man's rifle and jammed the rifle in the ground at the head of the grave, with the soldier's dog tags hanging on the stock and his helmet on top of the butt. We did pass about 10 new graves, obviously dug during the night, and this must have been the toll of our grenades. There was no way of knowing, of course, how many additional might have been wounded. As we continued forward, a frightful, almost inhuman scream came from the hedgerow close by on my left. I jumped through and found a wounded German bellowing in terror. He lay in the cart trail that ran down the middle of the hedgerow, and he was right in the path of one of our tanks. The tank was buttoned up, and the driver probably couldn't even look down to the road through his vision slits. I instinctively jumped in front of the tank, waved it to a halt, and dragged the wounded man to the side. His eyes showed me gratitude far better than words, for I wouldn't have understood words anyway. I couldn't help wondering whether a German would have helped me the same way, but somehow, a helpless wounded man didn't seem like an enemy. As we finally came to the first buildings on the edge of Le Mesnil-Herman, we began to pick up some sniper fire and had to hit the ground and then run from cover to cover. We moved quickly from house to house and found that most of the enemy had fled. As we crossed one street, my radio man was shot by a sniper hiding in the upper floor over a store. I had crossed the road myself, running hard, with the radio man following. It seems he had dropped a K-ration box, roughly the size of a carton of cigarettes, in the street, and stupidly went back to pick it up. When he bent down to pick it up, the sniper got him. Our platoon medic rushed out to pull the radio man back, but he was already dead. Before the medic could run back, the sniper shot him in the side, even though he wore on chest and back the big red cross on white background that is supposed to give immunity. The medic was able to drag himself back to shelter, where he calmly dressed his own wound and stayed in action. He would have evacuated a rifleman with a similar wound, but he knew how badly he himself was needed. To my mind, the medics were the unsung heroes of the war. Their duty was so routinely hazardous that it was hard to tell when they went beyond its call. Most important was their deep effect on morale. We just knew that if we ever got hit, a medic would come out to get us, no matter where or when. Later, when we were able to reach the radio man, we found he had stuffed his pockets, his shirt, and even his oversized leggings with boxes of K-rations. He had lost his life over a box of barely palatable survival food. Now we had 3 men definitely killed, and each was unnecessary. The man who stood up in the open and fired at an armored half-track, the one buried by our tank, and the chowhound. Sergeant Williams also was wounded in this action, but he was a very unusual case. A mortar shell had exploded near him, and even though the medic could not find a scratch on him, he was paralyzed from the neck down. He could move nothing but his eyes. This same Sergeant Williams had taken a bullet through the neck around D-Day and returned it to the front in 6 weeks. He had a very heavy, bull-like neck, but, it seemed to me, he had returned too quickly after such a severe wound. He was an exceedingly stubborn individual, for he recovered from his second injury and returned to action in September. Then he was too close to a German grenade and was paralyzed a second time. After his subsequent recovery, he again applied for frontline action, but was finally turned down. Some guys really did take a lot of punishment and had the starch to come back willingly for more. After going through the few remaining buildings in Le Mesnil-Herman, I was ordered to take my platoon around to the left side of town and clear out a pocket of cherries in an apple orchard. Along with some tanks, we made our way to the first hedgerow on the edge of the apple orchard, about 200 yards beyond the northeast corner of town. These tanks were from the 66th Regiment of the 2nd Armored Division, and we had trained together as a team for breaking through hedgerows. Our practice was for the tanks to fire all out at the hedgerow as they advanced, and when they got close enough, they would raise their fire, and my platoon would duck under, rush in, and toss grenades over the hedge at any krauts waiting to ambush the tank. This was the way our attack on the apple orchard began, but for some unknown reason, the lead tank did not wait for our grenades, but plowed right on through the hedgerow. As the tank tilted upward on a small crest of dirt, it had plowed ahead. The waiting Germans hit it with a Panzerfaust in the underbelly. The tank immediately burst into flames, but continued to roll on for about 30 yards until it stopped against an apple tree. It was the second of our 17 tanks to be knocked out by Panzerfaust near Le Mesnil-Herman. The sergeant in command of the tank climbed out of the turret and, with .45 pistol in hand and bleeding from his nose and ears, he charged back at the hole his tank had made in the hedge and captured the 6 Germans who had ambushed him and who were by then waiting for the rest of us to come through. Without pause, the sergeant then asked for help to get his wounded crew out of the tank. Several of us rushed right out and got 2 of the crew out, but it was now too hot to go in for the driver and assistant driver. They both were dead anyway, the sergeant said. After dragging the 2 wounded tankers back to our side of the hedge, we yelled for a medic, and the wounded medic himself came up to help. He immediately asked for an ambulance, and so the tank captain got on his radio. One of his half-track ambulances soon arrived and drove right out to the hedge where the wounded lay. At this point, the rest of us were ordered to fall back 100 yards to another orchard and take cover with the remaining tanks. The captain thought we were too much of a target and would attract shelling up where we were. So we watched from a distance as the ambulance driver and the crippled medic tried to load the wounded tank men onto stretchers and then into the ambulance. The painful wound in the side prevented our heroic medic from bending much or lifting. He couldn't help the driver, and so they had to call out for aid. The tank captain asked for volunteers, and 4 of my riflemen went right out. The 4 of them worked as a team and quickly loaded the first wounded man into the ambulance. They were grouped around the next man, about to lift his stretcher, when a mortar shell, which came down vertically without a sound, exploded with a bright flash and sharp crack right on the stretcher. The wounded man was blown to bits. He never knew a thing. Our 4 volunteers were all hit badly, though they did manage to struggle aboard the ambulance with the driver's help. Our medic was killed. Later, when I got the chance, I wrote up the tank sergeant for a Silver Star and requested a posthumous one for the valiant medic. My 4 wounded volunteers were each put in for a Bronze Star. It seemed so terribly little to do for them. I happened to exchange glances with the tank captain, a really huge man, and then quickly looked away. He was crying. My own emotions weren't any too strong. It sure was tough to lose good men, and you never can get used to it. After the ambulance pulled away, we went right on through the apple orchard, and by this time found no more enemy troops. On the way back, we heard a moan coming from one of the farmhouses near the edge of town, and found a badly wounded young German soldier lying on a pile of blood-soaked bedding in the middle of the bare floor. It seems one of our planes had strafed his unit the day before, and a .50 caliber machine gun bullet had entered the top of his right shoulder and gone out under his arm after puncturing a lung. Air sucked through a large hole in his side each time he took a breath. Judging from the amount of blood caked on the bedding and on him, I didn't see how he could still be alive. I covered his wounds to try to stop the air from sucking in too much dirt, and our ambulance team took him to the rear. They thought he would pull through, but I never heard any more about him. We hoped our wounded might get the same kind of humane treatment from the Germans. With Le Mesnil Hermann secure, we dug in for the night along the road on the southeast side of town. The Germans were watching us, of course, the whole time, and we soon received some very concentrated shelling. This was my personal introduction to the famous German 88mm artillery piece. The shells traveled faster than sound, hitting the ground all around us before we heard their incoming whistle. This time, we were very lucky, simply because a great many shells did not explode. Later, we learned the French resistance had been sabotaging 88mm shells. I counted 8 duds sticking in the ground within 30 yards of my foxhole. So, thank you, Mr. Frenchman. That night, as usual, I went around a couple of times to check my men and found one asleep on guard. When on the actual front, we always kept half the men on guard at all time, following the buddy system, one man on guard while his buddy slept. I really gave the soldier hell, trying my best to scare the life out of him. He assured and reassured me it never would happen again, so I let him off. Perhaps some may say I should have court-martialed him, but we all were on our last legs, and I felt he deserved another chance. As it turned out, he later proved himself a good soldier, a man I could always count upon. As my second day of combat came to a close, I found my casualty list very high. Of my original 40 men, 3 had been killed in my presence and 15 others were wounded, although this last was optimistic, in that it included the 8 men on the burning tank. Totally exhausted by 2 endless days of fighting, I quickly fell asleep in the shallow foxhole I had managed to scoop out. It was about 18 inches deep and barely wide enough and long enough to lie in. The ground was hard and damp, and we didn't have a blanket, so we just lay down with our clothes on and used our helmets for pillows. Only a man, completely done in, could manage to sleep like that. Our combat fatigues were chemically impregnated to keep out enemy gas, but they also kept in all the July heat and body odors. Fortunately, we were in the open air and rather busy, for we were becoming a bit fragrant. It was a good 30 days before we got a change of clothes, and what a relief. The Army engineers set up hot showers in the open fields, and they were really great, but they never had them very close to the front. Now, at the end of the second day of a great drive, we were a solid 6 miles deep into enemy territory. We had no idea what units behind us might be doing, but our great hope was that General Patton's army might have started through the gap we had opened.